Today, in world literature, we turn to the Chinese writer Ling. Born in 1904, Ling attended Peking University and wrote, from the first, about social injustice, about the position of women in Chinese culture. Our lecturer, Dr. Diane Simmons, pays special attention to the story When I Was in Xia Village, the work that was well received with controversy when it was published in 1941. The theme of the story, it's a real tragedy to be a woman, invites comparison with the film Raise the Red Lantern.
The writer Ling was born in 1907 into a world in crisis. Imperial China, which had been one of the world's most powerful and self-sufficient cultures for centuries, was in disarray. During the 19th century, the country had been racked with peasant rebellions and challenged by an expanding Europe. The West had not hesitated to use its superior military might to force China to open its doors to the Europeans and Americans who wished to profit by Chinese wealth. By the time of Ling's birth, China had been divided up into spheres of foreign influence. When Ling was 5, the emperor was deposed and a republic was founded, an event that was greeted with great hope by those who wanted to reform China so that it could face the Western challenge and successfully enter the modern world. But the republic soon proved a disappointment, and the country grew increasingly chaotic. As with central government weakened, warlords vied for power. Though this was a period of great demoralization and decline, it has also been seen as an immensely creative period for tradition-bound Chinese society, as new ways were tried out and old patterns broken. The turmoil of this period would lead to a breakdown of the Confucian values that had guided China for centuries, and the growth of nationalistic and socialist thinking that would lead eventually to the dictatorship of the Communist Party, which has controlled China from 1949 to the present. As a young, educated woman coming of age in the midst of this ferment, Ling would become one of China's most famous writers and cultural revolutionaries. She was heir to a cultural movement called the May 4th movement, after the date of a large student uprising, in which students attacked what they saw as the evils of traditional Chinese society. One of the evils the revolutionaries saw was the old Confucian order of hierarchy and status. The radicals denied the validity of the ancient three bonds of Confucian society: subordination of subject to ruler, of son to father, of wife to husband. And it denounced the three virtues upon which these bonds rested: loyalty to superiors, loyalty to father, and female subjection, claiming that these so-called virtues were really props of despotism, both in the state and in the family. At the same time that they denounced the old system, the May 4th radicals looked abroad for new ideas, eagerly seeking out Western writings. In this time of intellectual ferment, there was a great deal of literary activity, as new newspapers and magazines were begun, and the rate of book publishing rose sharply. Writers like the young Ling were at the forefront of this movement. For Ling, one of the few female members of the May 4th movement, a central question in the revolution of Chinese society was that of the treatment of women, and she addressed this question by placing women at the center of her fictional writings. According to Tanny Barlow in the introduction to Ling, I Am Myself a Woman, quote, "No other writer in this century has conveyed better how it felt to be a modern Chinese woman." Before we look at Ling's story, When I Was in Xia Village, it will be helpful to look at the position of women in traditional China, so that we can get a sense of the world the author is trying to change. In the traditional Confucian order, which is based on the central importance of the male family line, women tended to be viewed as outsiders, either potential deserters of their birth families or stranger intruders in their husbands' families, according to K.N. Johnson in her book, Women, the Family, and Peasant Revolution in China. Young girls who will inevitably leave their father's family to help build their husbands may be despised as useless parasites, maggots in the rice, as one saying has it. For in nurturing them, one only nurtures a valuable property that will ultimately belong to and enrich another male line. In times of economic dislocation, particularly the warlord period of the 1920s, The expendability of girls frequently led families to kill their girl babies or to sell girl children into slavery. While a scenario of submissive females and cruel mandarins has probably been embroidered upon by Western observers, it still cannot be denied that principles of male dominance are at the heart of traditional Chinese society, where, according to Johnson, Chinese women were embedded in perhaps the oldest, most highly developed male kinship system in history. In this system, women were not a recognized part of society. Rather, society was composed of male groups, and women existed in the spaces between these groups, not fully belonging to either the group in which they originated or the one into which they moved in marriage. Thus, women were subordinate and held to be inferior to men, not only because of male-oriented cultural values and attitudes of disdain, but also by structural patterns inherent in marriage and kinship, patterns that made men the rooted basis of community networks and made each new generation of women outsiders to social organization. Bride prices, the money paid by a man's family to get him a bride, reinforced the image of women as property, as reflected in the saying, "A woman is married like a horse is bought. You can ride them or flog them as you like." And the tradition of foot binding reveals attitudes toward women. In many parts of China, a woman was not considered suitable for marriage unless her feet had been bound, broken at the age of 6, bent under, tied, and allowed to rot in such a way that resulted in 3-inch feet, upon which they could not walk unaided. The custom was not simply a result of attitudes about female beauty, but also served to control women and underline their dependence upon males by literally prohibiting their ability to move. One manual on foot binding states, "Feet are bound not to make them beautiful as a curved bow, but to restrain women when they go outdoors." As the pressure of Western incursion increasingly disrupted China's economy in the 19th century, women, by virtue of their place at the bottom of the hierarchical scale, were often made to absorb excess economic pain. With the 19th century arrival of European American capitalism, the pattern of exploitation and erasure of women was only made worse. The opium trade and the introduction of cheap manufacturers, war taxes, and reparations brought about severe inflation and economic dislocation. For poor families, who bore the heaviest burden of taxation, usury, and crushing land rents, surplus value extracted from the labor of women and their sons was often the margin of survival, while the presence of more women than required for labor and reproduction threatened the survival of such families. The potentially hellish existence of many women in China in the early modern period has been acknowledged by the literature of early reform-minded writers. In Liu Taiyun's The Travels of Lao Tsan, written about 1904, Liu portrays the daughter of a starving family that has been ruined by a flood caused by official ineptitude. The desperate mother sells the girl into a brothel, where the treatment is such that she will not long survive. And in the story The New Year's Sacrifice by Lu Xun, who is generally considered China's first modern writer and claimed as a patron literary saint of the Communist Party, a poor woman is treated with increasing cruelty by an entire community as her troubles mount and her usefulness declines. But even death cannot free the woman from the abuses that all are free to heap upon her. For she stands accused of remarriage, an act which is considered a sin, for it confuses patriarchal lineage. She is deemed guilty of this sin, even though she was sold into the second marriage by her grasping first mother-in-law, and even though she tried to kill herself before the marriage could be consummated. For this sin, she is told, she will be tortured in the afterlife. Just think, she is warned by those who seem to be amused by her suffering and terror. When you go down to the lower world in future, those two men's ghosts will fight over you. To which will you go? The king of hell will have no choice but to cut you in two and divide you between them. In a story by another author, Ye Welin, entitled 5 Girls and One Rope, 5 young women, horrified by the conditions they observe in marriage, plot to hang themselves with the village sorceress's help. Finally, one of China's most famous real-life marriage protests was that of a bride named Xiao Wuzhen, who killed herself as she was being carried to her groom's house. Her death was the topic of an essay and numerous articles written by the young Mao Zedong, who would later become the leader of the Communist Party. Mao's articles, which are reported to have prompted an outpouring of response, argue that the Chinese marriage system, based on family arrangements rather than personal choice, is barbaric. It is against this background, then, that Ding Ling's stories must be placed. Her earlier writings, such as her first novella, The Diary of Miss Sophia, draw extensively from Western works, particularly Flaubert's Madame Bovary and Ibsen's A Doll's House. These classics of Western literature explore the entrapment of women in dead lives as a result of cultural conventions. At the end of Ding Ling's work, Miss Sophia's Diary, the Western-named Chinese heroine has understood her own entrapment, though she hasn't found a way to take positive action as a result of her understanding. At the end of the story, she says, "I've decided to take a train south, somewhere where no one knows me, where I can squander the remaining days of my life. The agony is gone, and I feel excitement. I laugh wildly. I feel so sorry for myself. Life sneaks on, death too. Oh, how pathetic you are, Sophia." Though the heroine may escape a conventional life, Ding Ling implies there is no place for her to go. Society has not yet found a place for free women. In this work, Ding Ling applies Western ideas about personal freedom to the Chinese theme, as she tries to think about the position of women. Soon, however, the political climate of China will change. After 1927, when the nationalist government purged itself of leftists and communists, those like Ding Ling, who believed in the necessity of class struggle and social revolution, came to feel that literature should not simply be about personal liberation, but that it must become a revolutionary statement, that it was literature's job to help bring about a class and social revolution in China. We can see Ding Ling exploring her changing view of the writer's role and the need, as one of her characters express it, to take the plunge from the intellectual movement into the workers' movement in her work entitled Shanghai Spring, 1930. In this novella, a celebrated writer finds himself dismissed by some critics on the charge that his work is empty and lacks social relevance. At the same time, he sees the new writing by political activists as trash and a passing fad. In the end, the writer is left alone, losing not only his literary prominence, but his lover, who, longing for meaning in her life, has left him to work for the communist movement. He laments, "Mei Ling, oh, such a woman, so generous and soft. Now she too had abandoned him to follow the masses. He had great ambition and talent, but it was in vain, because he could not go in that direction. He was left alone." By 1940, when our story, When I Was in Xia Village, was written, Ding Ling had joined the Communist Party at its revolutionary headquarters in Yan'an, from which position the party fought both the Japanese who had invaded China and the nationalists whom the communists considered reactionary throwbacks to the old system. During this time, intellectuals who had joined the communists increasingly came to feel that the point of their works must be to teach readers how Chinese culture should be transformed. For Ding Ling, who subscribes to this view, cultural transformation continues to require a change in how women are viewed and treated. Let's look then at the story When I Was in Xia Village to try to get a sense of how Ding Ling views the situation of women at this critical moment in Chinese history, as the communists, fighting on two fronts, try to envision the world they hope to build. Reading this story, we have to keep in mind that its aim is to teach its readers. It is a work of literature, but it is also, quite consciously, a work of propaganda. The story begins with the arrival of an unnamed narrator, a Communist Party worker who has come to Xia Village for a few weeks to rest. Parts of the village have recently been destroyed by the Japanese invaders, the Jap Devils as they are called, and as the narrator arrives, the place, once full of life, is ominously empty and silent. Even here at the beginning of the story, we can see that this is not a normal time, that village life has been profoundly affected by the great political and military events taking place around it. The air of mystery continues as the narrator is taken to her quarters, and she realizes that the villagers are obsessed by some event that has recently taken place. Now a crowd of villagers arrives. They have been watching at one of the village gates for someone to come, it seems, and now all are trying to get a look at the newcomer, who seems to be a woman. Listening to the comments, the narrator thinks it must be the arrival of a new bride that has gotten the villagers so excited. They say, "Have you seen her yet?" "Yes, I've seen her. I was a little afraid." "What is there to be afraid of? She's just a human being, and prettier than ever, too." With this, Ding Ling hints of her direction. The conversation does make it sound like the woman is a bride. But we know that for Ding Ling and her fellow radicals, who see Chinese marriage customs as oppressive to women, the bride is the symbol of female imprisonment. For when a woman becomes a traditional bride, she becomes the possession of her husband and her husband's family, and by extension, the entire male-dominated community. Slowly, we come to realize that the woman has been captured and repeatedly raped by Japanese soldiers and has contracted a venereal disease. In showing that a woman, first thought to be a bride, has really been imprisoned and raped, the author gives us what she hopes will be a moment of recognition, forcing us to ask, why did it sound as if a bride were arriving? Is capture and rape somehow similar to traditional marriage, into which women are forced with no regard for their feelings? Slowly and somewhat hazily, we are given the details of the case. The girl, Shen, was captured by the Japanese after she fled her father's house to avoid an arranged marriage. After being raped by many Japanese soldiers and made the wife of a Japanese officer, she has also become a spy for the Chinese communists against the Japanese. Even after she has returned to Chinese-held territory, she has been ordered by communist authorities back behind Japanese lines to carry out unspecified secret missions. She goes on these solitary missions even though she's now suffering so painfully from her disease that every single step, she says, is painful. She goes, it is implied, because the Japanese enemy must be resisted and because, quote, no one could be found to take my place. And despite her suffering, she finds the courage to go on when she sees that her clandestine work has helped the communist fighters. She says, as I watched the Jap devils suffer defeat in battle and the guerrillas take action on all sides as a result of the tricks I was playing, I felt better by the day. I felt even though my life was hard, I could still manage. Clearly, we are to understand that the woman, Zhen, is both a victim and a heroine. She has undergone immense suffering as a result of being captured and raped, but even in a weakened condition, has heroically served her people against their enemy. Further, the narrator's own description of the young woman gives us to understand that despite the suffering and danger she's been through, she's still a good and true person. She has been toughened, but her humanity has not been destroyed. When she first meets Zhen, the narrator compares the young woman's eyes to, quote, two open windows in a summer home in the country, clear and clean. Later, upon getting to know Zhen, the narrator comments, I like people who are enthusiastic and lively, who can be really happy or sad, and at the same time are straightforward and candid. Zhen was just such a person. Lest we think that this judgment is the narrator's alone, we're also given the view of one of the young communist soldiers who joyfully reports on Zhen's spying activities. He said, I never thought she could be so great. Given then that the author shows Zhen to be both blameless victim and selfless hero, how are we to understand the reception she receives from much of Xia village, particularly from the older, more traditional people? The narrator reports on the gossip she overhears, in which the villagers seem to feel that Shen has committed a crime by being captured and raped by enemy soldiers. They exhibit no pity for the girl, only excitement about the awful details of the case and contempt that she has allowed herself to be so soiled. They express their amazement that she would think to return now that she's been so damaged, saying, did you get a look at her? I hear her disease has even taken her nose. That's because she was abused by the Jap devils. She has slept with at least 100 men. Such a shameful woman. She should not be allowed to return. Someone else says, who knows what she did there? Now she's worse than a prostitute. Not only do the gossips blame Zhen for her own victimization, but they also suggest her troubles are a result of her bad character. They say that girl was always frivolous. It's suggested further that she may have found profit and enjoyment in her experience. Someone said she's even wearing a gold ring that the Jap devil gave her, and I understand she's been as far away as Dantong and seen many things. Not only do the older villagers seem utterly unable to empathize with the young woman's suffering and heroism, but her family too, in their continuing determination to get their daughter safely married off, seems to be thinking only of their own embarrassment. To blame the daughter for what has happened, giving no thought at all to what their daughter might be feeling. You are so heartless, the mother scolds when the daughter refuses the marriage. You don't think of your mother and father at all. You don't care how much I have suffered because of you. Don't you feel sorry for your mother? What is the author trying to show by telling this story? I believe she's trying to demonstrate how, in her view, the older generation, still part of the old Confucian order, simply cannot see a woman as other than a possession, valuable only for her ability to reproduce in support of her husband's family. In this scheme of things, it is the woman's primary responsibility to protect her reproductive system, her value, and she is at fault for not doing so, for allowing the goods to be damaged, even if she couldn't possibly have prevented this from happening. In this philosophical scheme, the woman's feelings, her desires, her suffering, simply aren't the point, and any feelings she may have are ignored. Nor does the young woman's heroism against the hated enemy seem to impress the old-fashioned villagers or endear her to them. Since women are viewed as objects to be used rather than as important actors on the social stage, the villagers seem unable to grasp that a young woman could actually do heroic deeds. But while Ding Ling abhors the reaction of the villagers, she also has hope for the future. She notes that the young people, naturally they were all activists, she says, are good to Zhen, and that the young communist soldier appreciates her heroism. But most striking of all is the response of Zhen herself. She does not, like the woman in Lu Xun's story, The New Year's Sacrifice, beaten down by the callous attitudes of those around her, retreat into insanity and death. Nor does she, like the girls in the story Five Girls in One Rope, and like many such shamed Chinese women, commit suicide. She does not destroy herself because she does not accept the charge that she has committed a crime or wronged her parents and her village. Rather, Ding Ling implies, Zhen has been strengthened by the new view of society that the communists have brought, and refuses to see herself as the damaged possession of others. Berated and badgered, she feels pain but does not give in. Looking at her tormentors with teeth tightly clenched, she looked ready to stand up to all of them. Rather than accept the view that she has been destroyed by her painful experiences, Zhen does what Ding Ling believes all of China must do: use misfortune to propel herself into a new way of seeing the world. Thus, rather than kill herself or stay in Xia village to be scorned for the rest of her life, she makes plans to leave, to join the communists in Yan'an, where she will be treated for her physical disease and where education will help her start life fresh. As the story ends, the narrator also leaves Xia village, lets us know that Zhen will survive her ordeal and will build a new life. I wasn't sad as I went away. I seemed to see the bright future that Zhen had before her. And what about Ding Ling's own future? After the communists came into power, she was briefly one of the country's most visible cultural leaders. As such, she has been implicated in the party's efforts to stifle free literary expression, to make sure literature adheres to the party line. In 1957, for reasons that are not entirely clear, she fell from power and was exiled to Manchuria, where she continued to write. During the Cultural Revolution, she, along with thousands of intellectuals, was seized by the Young Red Guards, her work destroyed, and after being publicly humiliated, she was imprisoned, part of the time in solitary confinement. When in the late 1970s she was rehabilitated, she refused to blame the party for her suffering. She came to be seen as increasingly authoritarian when compared with young writers who took risks to express views different from those of the party.
When I write, my pen follows the thread of my imagination, and I stick to my first impulses, not trying to refashion the characters I have known and loved in my life and who become the heroes and heroines of my books. So Ding Ling wrote in her 1986 essay, Self-Portrait of a Woman Writer. Today, her work is important in that it gives us insight into a significant period in modern China and the shifting roles of women in the 20th century.